All right. Hello, everyone. I'm James Miller with the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. Um, Welcome to Nature Connects, our ongoing webinar series focused on providing an opportunity for you to hear from and ask questions of some of our incredible staff members and partners working toward a world in which people and nature can thrive. If you've participated in a Nature Connects webinar before, welcome back. If this is your first time with us, thank you so much for joining. In summer 2019, GoPro cameras plunged into the waters off Massachusetts Duxbury and Cotuit harbors on a mission to film underwater habitats created by oyster farms. These underwater views of how fish are using gear used to grow oysters are part of an ongoing collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, Island Creek Oysters, Cotuit Oyster Company, Northeastern University, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Northeast Fisheries Science Center. The most fundamental goals of the work: to evaluate, better understand, and document how shellfish farming can improve environmental conditions. That's, of course, the thumbnail version, and we're here today to get a much more thorough version of this work, and also hear a little bit about the global context in which it's happening. Our first presenter today, or one of our two guests, is Chris Sherman, the president of Island Creek Oysters. A Duxbury native, Chris was, perhaps unsurprisingly, an English major in college before returning to his roots, joining Island Creek in 2009 and becoming its president in 2013. Chris is focused on the future of aquaculture and the direction of Island Creek Oysters. As his official bio says, Chris is always thinking about what's next while also nodding to the deep-rooted history of the shellfish industry. Steve Kirk is the Coastal Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. His responsibilities include implementing, developing, and monitoring statewide and regional coastal conservation strategies. Before joining TNC, Steve spent most of his professional life on the water as a fisheries researcher and also as a captain of tugboats and tall ships. He also owned an oyster farm. So before we get started, here's the setup for today. Webinar attendees are muted. Steve, Chris, and I are going to chat for about 20 minutes before we turn to your questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box on the screen. You can enter them at any time during the initial conversation or the ongoing discussion. If you want to direct your question to either Chris or Steve, please indicate that in the Q&A box. We'll probably have about 20-25 minutes for the Q&A. We apologize in advance for any questions we don't get to. If you have technical problems, please let us know via the separate chat box on your screen, and we'll do everything we can to help. Also, if you have any trouble with the view, there is a pull-down menu near the top center of your screen where you can choose an option fit to window, and that should correct the problem. Thanks again so much, everyone, for joining us here today, and welcome, Chris and Steve.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks, Shane.
Yeah, thank you both for being here. So, Steve, I guess we'll start with you, and let's kind of start with the bigger picture. You know, what is aquaculture, and why is the Nature Conservancy involved globally with it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, James, for the setup there. And you know, thinking about TNC's mission to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And to reiterate what you said right at the top, and trying to think creatively about you know, how we can work to achieve a world where people and nature thrive. We're looking at a planet with upwards of 50 billion people coming in the coming decades, and food is a big part of that world where we need to, you know, have a population that is nourished and thriving, and we need nature to be in the same scenario, nourished and thriving. We need both of those. So TNC is working on food more broadly, in terrestrial systems, and thinking about how to make more food for more people in a way that's harmonious with the environment. And aquaculture is one piece of that. So aquaculture at the high level is simply growing plants and animals in the water. It's a all-encompassing term that would include things like growing fish and shellfish and seaweed species. It might be on land, it might be in coastal waters or offshore. It's important because it's the fastest growing food production system on the planet. TNC is interested in working in the space because it really is a resource efficient means of producing food. So, shellfish, which is largely what we're going to be talking about today, is an important component of that, really because of a couple of things. Shellfish are important to our coastal ecosystems, and shellfish farms are one way of putting them back in the water. As a conservation organization, often when we think about growing food, a lot of times you think about trying to reduce the negative impacts of growing food, like using a lot of water or using a lot of fertilizer. As we approach aquaculture, particularly with shellfish, we really think about turning that sort of central tenet on its head and thinking about maximizing benefits of growing food, which we think is a sort of interesting place to be. So that's sort of the high level why we're working around the world on aquaculture.
Thanks, Steve. So with that as the high level, what about in Massachusetts? Why did TNC in Massachusetts get involved with aquaculture?
Yeah, I mean, it's really because of that opportunity. We are thinking about how to produce healthy seafood for our population, a growing population, as well as there's really a growing body of evidence that is supporting this idea that shellfish farms can actually improve the environmental condition in the environment where they're located. So shellfish are filter feeders, and so there's a water quality component to having a shellfish farm in a particular location. And also, as you see in some of these slides here, this photo shows one type of oyster growing gear or equipment that oysters are inside that. And there's a interplay between the gear being there and how fish and other species in the marine environment are using the gear. So that habitat component is something that we're really interested in better understanding. And like I said, there's a growing body of evidence that shows that the habitat value of having a farm is really important, and we're really just building on that hypothesis and that existing evidence here in our own backyard.
With that setup, can you give a little bit of an overview of the project on which TNC and Island Creek are collaborating?
Yeah, right. And you mentioned the other partners up in the intro, and this really is a collaborative effort. We're sort of maybe the glue that brings this exciting team together. Clearly we're working with Island Creek, and Chris, thanks for being on for this and for the partnership. More broadly, but we're working with another farm, our farmer partner down in Barnstable with Chris Gargiulo at Katuitt Oyster Company. We're bringing academic partners on with Kelsey Schultz in John Grabowski's lab at Northeastern University. And we're working with Julie Rose and her whole team down at the Milford lab, as you were saying, the NOAA's Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And the project is really sort of geared toward trying to build the science around what is sort of an anecdotal truth that many farmers will tell you, that there's really great recreational fishing around their farm. You just actually see a lot of fish and life around the farm. And we're just bringing some scientific rigor to that hypothesis. And when in this picture that you see in the background, the tide is out and the gear is resting on the bottom. When the tide comes in, it's not like walking out of the barn at your other farm and looking at the cornfield to see what birds are flying overhead or what species are running around on the ground. You just can't see. The water is covering it. So we're, as you see in this picture, we're using underwater cameras to get a look at what is using the farm and comparing that across different growing gear types and other valuable habitats. And so that's sort of a once over on the project.
Thank you. And Chris, again, I just reiterate Steve's thanks, to you for being here and for the collaboration in general. So I guess the best place to start is with Island Creek Oysters. Can you just tell us a little bit about the company?
Absolutely. So Island Creek was actually founded 25 years ago by the gentleman you see in the picture, Skip Bennett. Started out as an oyster farm. Skip was among the first people in New England to really, give shellfish farming a go, from the standpoint of trying to make a living. And was alone out in Duxbury Bay for the first 8 years of the farm's existence. And it's just so happened that Duxbury Bay is a phenomenal place to grow oysters. There aren't a lot of native oysters in Duxbury Bay. It's kind of more known for clams and mussels and other shellfish. It's a very productive system. But really, Skip was kind of like the first person to stroll into Napa Valley and put a grapevine in the ground. He found an incredible place to grow oysters. And, it became clear very early on, apologies, I muted my cell phone. I did not mute my cuckoo clock. You can hear that in the background. It became clear very early on as business people, particularly as we started getting staff, really close to the time where I came on about 10 years ago, that we were highly dependent on one crop in one bay, and that was a risky position to be in. So we started diversifying our business. And one of the things we did, we actually started selling our product directly to chefs. And those chefs really became a platform for us. And they recognized the quality of the product we were growing. We were kind of rapidly adopted by some of the best chefs in the country and the world. Restaurants like Le Bernardin in New York City. Eric Repair was an early customer. And really most notably, Thomas Keller took our product and made it part of his signature dish, oysters and pearls, which is on the menu at Per Se and the French Laundry every night. And from there, that really kind of grew our popularity with the rest of the chef community. And we started kind of engaging with those chefs and doing events and kind of building awareness, really in the early days as an excuse to go party. But what we found early on is that we started to develop a brand. People recognized Island Creek. And for us, we've always been a mission-driven company from the get-go. There were many years in the beginning where we gave more money to, what little money we had to, causes around coastal communities and aquaculture than we made, as a business or as business people. And thankfully, those days are over. But we've used this brand to really get into a bunch of different business channels, but also to kind of enhance that mission. That we and now our 100 or so staff are kind of out on. And those businesses are the distribution that I mentioned. Right now, with the virus going on, we are very heavily into the direct-to-consumer online retail business, selling seafood over the internet. We also are partners in a restaurant group. We have 2 restaurants in Boston and 2 more in the kind of New England area, along with a shop up in Portland, Maine. We've got a facility for distribution down in Brooklyn, New York. And the other thing I should mention in the kind of mission aspect of this is our foundation, which we started just about a decade ago. And primarily we do international development projects that leverage aquaculture as a sustainable and affordable source of protein and jobs in communities that really need it. So we're active in Haiti and in East Africa. And now we find ourselves still headquartered in Duxbury, the town where a lot of us grew up, really trying to look at farming practices and how to marry our day-to-day operations as best as possible with that mission to promote sustainable aquaculture and the coastal communities that depend on it.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the next question, which is, why for Island Creek was it important to collaborate with TNC and others on this particular project?
Yeah, so it was really a great timing, and we've enjoyed a great relationship with the Nature Conservancy, and this is just one manifestation of it. But it worked out very well because for a long time, as Steve mentioned in his intro, the environmental benefits of shellfish and shellfish farming have been touted by advocates, by industry, by the public sector, and as an industry and a business, we are always talking. I go and talk to media and do speaking engagement. I talk about the tremendous environmental benefits of shellfish. They're filter feeders, as Steve mentioned, but there's also these other ancillary benefits that we're learning about now. But really, we felt like we needed to do our part as farmers in that process. So much about the environmental benefits are really just the intrinsic qualities of the oysters themselves. So our mission has been, okay, well, what can we do as farmers to kind of enhance those environmental benefits and really put our practices under a microscope and understand from a scientific standpoint what those impacts in our environment are. And the Nature Conservancy is kind of the perfect partner to do that with because of the scientific expertise and rigor that they can bring to the table and act as that validating third party to help us kind of examine these practices and also gain insight into what we can do to change the way we're farming in order to enhance those benefits.
Chris, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between shellfish farming and the environment? And what I specifically am wondering about is, you're in an industry where you're directly, visibly connected and reliant upon the natural world. And I just wonder how you think that impacts the work you do and the way you think about it.
Sure. The relationship is an intimate one. And, it's very much symbiosis, perhaps even more than terrestrial farming, simply because the impacts that we have kind of play out on a minute-to-minute basis. Every time we walk out on the flat, we really are the only humans out there. And I think if you talk to Skip, he very much considers himself one of the charismatic megafauna among the ecosystem. He's been out there for 50 years. His father was a lobsterman. Before him, he dug mussels, you name it. So that is really an informing ethos. However, as I mentioned previously, bringing some real intellectual rigor to bear on that, what is our role as a participant in that ecosystem is really important because we depend so mightily on the health of the ecosystem in order to keep farming and to keep our business going. And as we've learned over the last, 10, 20, 30 years of shellfish farming here in the Northeast about methods and the way shellfish can be farmed in the environment, we've learned as much about the animals themselves as we have around the ecosystem that they exist in. So for us, every day we're learning. Certainly the ecosystem is changing. We'll talk more, I think, a little bit later in the seminar about Duxbury Beach and the bay where we farm. It's a highly dynamic system. So it's something that we think a lot about. People ask me what I'm up at night worrying about, and that environment in our ecosystem is certainly one of the things that we cherish and want to take the best care of we possibly can.
Thank you, Chris. And having spent a morning out at one of your farms with Skip, I appreciate the charismatic megafauna analogy. So Steve, let's jump back, if we could, to the collaboration, and can you talk a little bit about what the first year's like, and what you've seen and learned so far?
Yeah, I see this slide up here is showing some of the images we've captured. These are images that came from the farm up in Duxbury, and the first year of doing any field research, I think we had some lessons learned and some R&D to do. Anybody who's worked in the marine environment knows that it's not simple, and so things like making sure that the camera's batteries could last for, a 12-hour tide cycle, or making sure that they don't flood and fill with water were some of the early challenges in terms of just the simple field work. Beyond that, like I said, I think we've been able to capture some really compelling imagery. The striped bass hanging out underneath the floating cage is probably sort of the most charismatic images we've caught. And in fact, one day I was out doing a sampling event with the Northeastern team, and being able to be in and among the cages and see the stripers just like that hanging out underneath, sort of holding station below a cage, was sort of a very cool moment. Down in Cotuit, one of the really exciting things we're seeing is a lot of juvenile black sea bass, and the not all the data has been analyzed yet, so I don't feel like we're sort of in a place to give any sort of definitive results. But like the images here are sort of showing what we're seeing, at least up in Duxbury. And again, the sort of exciting seeing a lot of fish congregating around those cages down in Cotuit has been an exciting early finding.
Chris, I think you alluded to this earlier. So this work we have the images, but I think it is a little bit difficult sometimes to visualize what it all really looks like. Can you kind of take us out? I mean, tell us more about the sites. What's out there? What does it normally look like, and what does it look like when the work is happening?
Sure. I love talking about this site in particular because it's one of my favorites. I grew up here in this bay, and the opportunity to share it with people is one of the best parts of my job. This site in particular is the place where we grow our Aunt Dottie oysters, is what we call them. We call each oyster by a different name when it's grown at a different location, simply because the environmental factors at play have a great influence over the appearance, the flavor, kind of the product that ends up in a case, at a supermarket or on your plate at a restaurant. So it's important to us that we kind of draw those lines around the differentiation. And this site is only a few miles away from our kind of core Island Creek site in Duxbury. It's way, way, way out at the tip of Duxbury Beach. Duxbury Beach is kind of a classic barrier beach system. You have a protected bay behind it, the ocean on the other side, and just a small spit of sand which kind of moves all over the place with a head at the end. And this farm is kind of tucked into the elbow of the head, and it's actually on tidelands that Skip's family has owned for hundreds of years. And so it's a really important place for the humans involved, as well as it is for the shellfish and for the other animals. It's one of the few sites that we have that you can actually walk out to from the beach. So as a research platform, it's pretty ideal. It's less, it's got more exposure to the tide. It's exposed for a good 2 hours every day. Whereas the Island Creek site, for instance, out in the middle of Duxbury Bay, is really only exposed for that long on big spring tides. So we're kind of really excited about this particular site. I should also mention that it's actually, it looks at Clark's Island, just across this tiny little channel from where the farm is, which is the place where the pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower actually spent their first night in Plymouth Bay. So it's a really special place.
No, having been there, I wholeheartedly concur. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous spot. Let's see. So we're getting a few questions from attendees. So maybe we'll turn to those and just keep talking. Let's see. Steve, this might be, well, actually, it may be a better question, Chris, either one of you, but maybe this is better for you, Chris. During the, could you speak to the regulatory and policy challenges for aquaculture in Massachusetts and or the US more broadly? And then there's also a second part of that question, which is any work that TNC or Island Creek is doing around those challenges.
Steve, I can tee that one up and take a shot at it, and then you could probably finish up if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do it that way.
Great. So yeah, we do a tremendous amount of work on policy issues around particularly shellfish aquaculture, but certainly through our kind of broader advocacy around aquaculture more broadly conceived as well. Because we're operating in the marine environment, which jurisdictionally is always interesting, we end up interfacing with a tremendous number of regulatory agencies at the federal, state, local, tribal, county level. You name it. And one of the challenges that I've found, here in the U.S. in particular, but also kind of anywhere you go around the world. I did an Eisenhower Fellowship in 2018, and I went to 5 different countries and saw about 40 farms, and every single one of them has a permitting saga to tell, from a $100 million flatfish operation in Spain all the way to a small shellfish grower in Western Sahara. Everyone has had trouble getting permits. And part of that is good. We don't want to move too quickly in this fragile environment, but certainly it's a growth inhibitor. It inhibits the bad growth, but it also inhibits some of the good growth as well. So if I could characterize the kind of main issue that people encounter, is that because this is a relatively new business activity, and because of the kind of jurisdictional challenges around the actual place where marine aquaculture in particular operates, often we find that there is kind of a lack of understanding around ownership, with our kind of government connection points. So for instance, one issue is it fishing or is it farming? And so in the federal government, is it NOAA or is it USDA? And that kind of plays itself out all the way down to the kind of the town or local level, here in Massachusetts. So what we've tried to do a lot is work with our regulators and also the other kind of public sector stakeholders in the process to try to understand that and think about the way these bureaucracies are structured, the expertise and core competencies that they have, and kind of which aspects of aquaculture should really live and who owns them. And that's been a pretty productive process for us thus far. Luckily for us as shellfish aquaculture operators, because largely we are viewed as beneficial, often we have a fight over people who want to own us and not really necessarily the hot potato. But fighting for research dollars and things like that is certainly something we think a lot about, certainly. So I hope that's a concise explanation of a really broad and complex challenge, but I'm sure Steve can help fill in the gray areas.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't think I have that much to add, other than, one of the components is shellfish farming has been growing in the U.S. For the last couple of decades, and with that expansion, I think it sort of comes with growing pains. It's sort of a different way of saying what Chris has already mentioned. And so, one of the things that we're also working on is trying to understand how the public perceives this expansion. And so, actually, a whole separate component of some work that we're engaged on, again, with our team at Northeastern, is trying to think about how the public is perceiving this growth. And, you can understand the challenge points of, these farms are taking place in what, as Chris mentioned, the ownership question is a real one. And in most cases, it's owned by the government. And so, people are granted the right to, have their farm and practice their farming techniques on a particular location for a particular amount of time, which is pretty different than terrestrial farming. And, with it happening in many cases in a public sphere, there's understandable opposition. You see either seeing people benefit in a private way on a public space is something that, when in conflict with another user group, is a challenge. So we're working to try to understand how the public writ large is perceiving aquaculture. And Massachusetts is a really interesting case study we're working on a project that spans the entirety of the East Coast, really trying to understand the drivers of that public perception and what might drive people to be supportive of, or what people, why people might be in opposition to shellfish or aquaculture development or expansion. So that's an ongoing project that we're really sort of interested to get to the heart of those public perceptions, so that we can help inform the growers that are interested in expanding and try to minimize the conflict, but also to roll that up to the decision makers who ultimately have a say whether the farm can be placed in a particular location. And that Massachusetts case study is really interesting, because largely the states will manage these nearshore aquaculture farms, whereas in Massachusetts it gets right down into the town level. And so, one thing that I think we can bring to this research, not only on the natural science but also on the social science, is using our TNC network in all of the coastal states to, look at lessons learned, look at outreach and education opportunities, and pull our, our coastal network team together to try to get to some answers for some of these pretty sticky questions.
Steve, seems one question we have is about kind of differentiating between shellfish aquaculture and fish farming. Can you tackle that a little bit, and just sort of how are they alike? How are they different?
Yeah, maybe we'll do it sort of in reverse order. Maybe I'll tee it up and let Chris see if he has anything to add on the back end. And so I think there certainly are differences. To highlight shellfish as a non-fed species, meaning that the way that they grow, become bigger, and ultimately go to market is you don't put food in the water. They extract the food that's naturally occurring in the water. And that, in a lot of cases, just because of, as we've mentioned before, the way that shellfish operate is providing an environmental benefit, particularly to places that have too many nutrients in the water, more algae in the water, and oysters help to clear those those nutrients out of the water column. That's the benefit. When you're thinking about fish farming, you do for them to grow, you have to add feed to the system. And so in thinking about sort of resource efficiency, and as I was mentioning at the top, thinking about food production systems and what you need to put in order to get a unit out, fish still are remarkably efficient. Shellfish sort of go below the curve in a positive way. So Chris, maybe you can pick it up and go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I think one way to frame it, and there's a great book by Paul Greenberg called For Fish, if anyone's interested in kind of learning more about some of these, the broader kind of ecosystem around these issues. There's a good chapter on aquaculture, and the way Paul frames it is to say that, one way to understand good aquaculture versus not so good aquaculture is to think about the origin of the species that is being farmed. So you've got aquaculture beginning in the mid 20th century, aquaculture as we know it now, with trying to find species that have high market value and putting them in a cage and trying to grow them out. So you've got sea bass, you've got tuna, you've got these large pelagics, that are used to huge territories, cruising around eating small fish, and you put them in a cage and they don't do well. And that results in a lot of the attendant issues around finfish aquaculture with diseases, sea lice, you name it. And when you think about species that are, have evolved in a different way over the last few millennia to adapt to very different conditions that more closely resemble life in a cage, those are the species that have been more successful, at least from a fish health and environment standpoint. Species like barramundi and tilapia and pangasius, have evolved to live life much more similar to life in a cage. And shellfish really are in keeping with that rule of thumb as well, because shellfish love to live in high density. They cluster in reefs. Really, the conditions on the farm that we're providing for them are optimized from a shellfish's point of view, which is, really the kind of foundation probably for a lot of the positive benefits that result from shellfish aquaculture. So there's a bit of a sliding scale there. And I think, as it pertains to finfish, Steve made a really good point just in stacking up finfish versus other proteins. It's still pretty good even when it's not. And I think that that's something that we all need to kind of wrap our heads around. Okay, degrees of that, what we're comfortable with, and then degrees of environmental interaction. I think there's still a lot of questions around that. And the positive aspect of it is that innovation in that finfish sector is progressing very quickly. And there's a huge gamut of operators, for better or for worse, but the best operators are doing so much better than they were, 20 or 25 years ago. So there's real positive change happening in the finfish sector.
Yeah, I might just sort of close it out in thinking about that's really where the Nature Conservancy sees opportunity, and to sort of drive home the message of why we're working on that. And we're thinking about this future development and innovation with aquaculture, with more seafood being produced on farms than getting landed at the dock from wild harvest fishing boats, and that trend likely to continue, is forecast to continue. Trying to steer that future development so that it's done in the most sustainable way is something that that our broader team is really focused on. Not only from determining what those best practices are that are most harmonious with the environment, but also like steering capital toward those good actors and the finance side of trying to make sure that development happens in the best way possible.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So we've got a lot of questions coming in. And it looks like, just as a time check, we've got a little around 20 minutes left. So this one is, I think, definitely for you, Chris. Are those Aunt Dottie's in the picture? And more generally, do you see other types of aquaculture, finfish, shrimp, shellfish, et cetera, being able to brand their product like you have?
Good question. So I guess two parts. We have, so those are Aunt Dottie's in the picture. They are, they're our tray grown oysters. So, the growing method has a huge impact on the product, so we think a lot about the environmental impacts on flavor and appearance and whatnot, but also the hand of the grower in that process is pretty important. So the husbandry decisions that we make, like putting them in those trays, is crucial. And so to answer this, I guess the second part of the question, the decommodification of oysters and the ability to kind of brand them like you would wine or craft beer or something like that, has been absolutely critical to the growth of the industry over the last 10 years in particular. We've kind of ridden the wave of people's kind of heightened interest in the origin of their food, but then also in the actual experience of eating it. And oysters are kind of the perfect thing for that time period. Whether that can be applied to other species in aquaculture, I think is somewhat dependent on the nature of the product itself. There are big variations in quality and flavor from farm to farm, from geographic region to geographic region. However, it's seldom that they're as inherent in the product itself as it is with oysters. They are kind of like wine in that regard. I do think that one of the areas for investment in seafood in general, but also in, more specifically in aquaculture, is in the supply chain and kind of downstream in the value chain, because we're trying to sell these incredibly innovative products from beautiful, farms in, like a halibut farm I went to in Norway last year, a great char operation in Iceland. These are some of the most innovative producers in the world, and they're selling their products through the same supply chain that groundfish and other kind of, tuna from Vietnam is kind of moving through. And so it has a tendency to get lost. And I think we could bring a lot of messaging and marketing and branding savvy to bear on these other products that could kind of provide that value all the way to the end user, which would have a tremendous kind of trickle down effect for those producers to help them grow and help incentivize them to engage in those practices, which are better for the fish, better for the environment, and ultimately result in a higher quality, more nutritious product. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'm not sure it's an exact parallel to the oysters, but there's quite a bit, I think, that other seafood producers can learn from the way that we've marketed ourselves as an industry.
Chris, I think this one probably also headed in your direction. Are there leases involved? I think we tackled this a little bit, but do oyster companies pay for the right to farm, and where do those funds go if so?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we've been working on. Until recently, I ran our state industry association, Mass Aquaculture. I'm on the board of East Coast Shellfish Growers as well. And so talking to our kind of public sector counterparts about, hey, how can we fund research? How can we fund ourselves essentially as an industry? Has often arrived back at the fees that we pay to the town and to the state and to the federal government for our leases. The leases are granted from the state in Massachusetts. However, they are administered by the town. So there's a kind of a minimum set of conditions that the state sets, and then the towns have to comply within that framework, but ultimately can make their own bylaws to get site specific about where farms are, how big they are, are the leases 10-year term, are they a lifetime term? There's kind of quite a bit of variation from community to community. And that's something that we see consistently with aquaculture worldwide, because the farming practices are so site specific. You really have to kind of listen to the site, kind of how it wants to be farmed. The regulation and the permitting structures around each site are very different from town to town and from state to state and country to country. So it evolves quite a bit as you move around. But in Massachusetts, we pay a nominal fee. We pay under $10,000 a year in permitting and licensing to the state and to the town. And really it's considered an administrative fee to cover the costs of setting up the leases and enforcement and things like that. Whereas if you look at Norway, for instance, with the salmon farms, which have obviously become a huge industry over the last, multiple decades, they pay millions of dollars for leases to the country, to the state of Norway. However, they get a lot more ownership rights over those leases as a result. The leases can be bought and sold and traded, and they have value. So there's a number of different ways to skin that cat. But right now we pay very little for the lease, but we don't own it, and we can't, it doesn't sit on our balance sheet or anything like that. So there's kind of gradations there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. And Steve, we have a couple of questions that sort of are related thematically. I'm going to try to pull them together a little bit. One is, has there been any thought on placing bottom oyster cages in areas subject to shore erosion as a natural breakwater? And then the other question was, are any aquaculture farms addressing coastal erosion in Massachusetts, including in Buzzards Bay?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We're thinking about a world where climate change is very real and having different impacts in different locations. So like in the Gulf of Mexico, southeastern US, the Nature Conservancy and others have engaged in a lot of shellfish restoration and have used shellfish and building reefs to slow wave energy, try to maintain basically the shoreline at the place where it is, where erosion is happening. That's, that case is certainly happening in our area to varying degrees, shoreline erosion, and, with sea level rise, with increasing storm intensity, really huge rain events, all of those factors, we're thinking about coastal resilience as a really important factor for, public safety, for the thriving coastal ecosystem. Can shellfish aquaculture play a role in that? I think it would be really site specific. And I think the management of the farm would have to be really geared toward that outcome, which is not really the bottom line driver of why you're going to site a farm in a particular location. So it has certainly been thought about, and we often think about restoration as a tool that has many benefits. One of it might be shoreline erosion, and bringing in in a private business and a farm to help achieve that is, I think, an interesting intersection, but we really haven't explored it in a really deep way.
Chris, anything you'd like to add on that question?
Yeah, I would say, like, zooming out a little bit, it's a really interesting subject to think about how to incentivize these, the blessing and the curse of aquaculture is that it is a for-profit business. So you have this tremendous power, for expansion and growth and impact when it's profitable. But when it's not, it can be challenging. So, if we think about ways to incentivize operators to engage in practices that maybe aren't the right in front of your face, bottom line, near term, best practice, but ultimately are doing the most amount of good and creating the most value for the environment, for, the long-term health of their business. And, one of the kind of dichotomies in aquaculture right now, when we think about where the innovation is taking, fish production, you kind of have two scenarios where, one is, there's an incredible farm that Dan Barber highlighted in a TED Talk he did called I Fell in Love with the Fish. And the farm is called Veta La Palma. It's in the south of Spain. And it's this beautiful farm that's one with the ecosystem. It's an incredibly unique ecosystem. But they grow, shrimp and fish in a kind of polyculture system. The birds, it's biodynamic. The birds are allowed to eat the fish, and they have this beautiful product. And that's kind of one vision, is this holistic polyculture, management, farming. And then the other kind of side of it is closed system. So you hack your way around the environment and really seal the farm off from the environment, so you don't have any sort of negative impact. And that's kind of the other way that this can go. But I think profit and investment are going to play a big role in it. The closed system farms, because of the scale that they have and because of the risk mitigation involved, are attracting a lot of institutional investment right now. So there's a tremendous amount of growth in that sector of the industry. On the kind of more holistic management side, there's growth there too. But that's an area that if we could find a way to provide more real economic incentives for growers to make those types of management decisions, that is a really interesting area for policymakers and other advocates to put time and energy right now.
Great, thank you, Chris. And so again, a lot of questions, a lot of really good questions, and we're limited time, so we do our best here. And so Steve, I think maybe you want to take a shot at this one first and then see if Chris would like to add. But what scaled programs could you envision that would broadly impact the perception of the desirability of aquaculture? Particularly with shellfish, this would seem to be a very critical element. Can this be joined with broader environmental constituent building activities?
Yeah, I think certainly it can be joined. It's been a natural partnership working with the industry. Even in a sort of quick tangent, I think one thing that we're seeing in the natural partnership of these private business people who are really reliant on having a functioning environment and a functioning ecosystem around their farm. We can leverage their economic impact and voice in public policy. So one partnership is this Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. Is a group of private business owners and restaurant owners and shellfish growers that are using their voice to try and advance progressive climate policy because their businesses are impacted by climate change. And so to bring constituents to, down to the Hill and advocate for, climate policy with their voice is a great tool to try and advance, different aspects of our and other organizations' missions to try and, work on the climate change knot. And, so it's sort of a great partnership and sort of one little tendril of where TNC is working with, natural resource users like fishermen, timber harvesters and shellfish growers is sort of in our wheelhouse and sort of the way that we work all the time.
Chris, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I would say like one of the great aspects of our partnership with the Nature Conservancy is the ability to kind of amplify one another's microphone, so to speak. So we have, really good outreach and engagement with our kind of brand advocates, and we've always kind of taken the tact of having these learning experiences, being able to educate people, but pairing it with entertainment and hospitality and having a really nice time. So, for instance, we do farm tours at our facility in Duxbury every year. We sell them. It's a for-profit business channel, but we host about 5,000 people every summer to come see the farm, and we hit them with this messaging around aquaculture and the environment. And we put a glass of rosé and a dozen oysters in front of them, and it really resonates. So one area that we've been able to kind of leverage TNC is by helping to perfect and to really think deeply about the messaging that we're giving those people so that it's maximizing its impact, but it's also scientifically accurate and and examined, and being able to kind of meld those two groups I think has been a great thing for both of us so far.
So I think we probably have time for about two more questions, and the first one I see would be: are there any plans for other types of aquaculture that use seaweed or kelp, native, of course, to provide more shelter for juvenile fish or other ecosystem benefits in Massachusetts? And I'm not sure if which of you would be best to answer that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think, like shellfish, growing different seaweeds like kelp, gracilaria, these other species provide a lot of environmental benefit. Like shellfish that are largely gone from their historic extent in our area. These underwater vegetation is largely gone from eelgrass beds, but also now thinking about to market consumer products like kelp that can be eaten or used in other commercial ways. It's sort of a compelling narrative to think about growing those species, and there are a handful of growers in Massachusetts and a handful more in Maine that are getting a little bit past the experimental phase, but it's really still in its infancy. One of the challenges has been the regulatory framework in growing these seaweeds. Is the market really hasn't been developed, and so it's, from the regulator's perspective, it's hard to know how to manage the processing and sale and ensuring public health around these relatively new products. I think there's good promise in growing in a commercial setting different seaweed varieties for human consumption, for other uses, in a similar way of growing shellfish, that there are these co-benefits like providing habitat for other species, where we need more habitat in our coastal waters, and having a commercial venture provide that by growing food or other things, we see that as an opportunity.
Chris, anything on that one?
Yeah, just specifically, there's just a few farms in Massachusetts that are growing sea vegetables. I think they're all pre-revenue. I think Steve touched on the major point about his market development is huge on that front. The farming potential, the production, it's easy to farm. You can do it at a large scale. The environmental benefits are incredible, particularly when they're coupled with shellfish. But the question is where does it get sold? And there are markets in biosciences, there's markets in cosmetics, there's food markets. There are potential, but not a lot of them have been developed. I will say that there's an operation up in Maine called Atlantic Sea Farms, formerly Ocean Approved, that's doing this at a pretty big scale. And there was a major breakthrough just before the virus kind of, crippled everything. David Chang, in a collaboration with Sweetgreen, actually created a seaweed salad that's available at Sweetgreen locations, which is huge because what we saw with oysters is really the best thing that happened to the market for oysters, counterintuitively, was more oysters. Having a critical mass and presence on menus and things like that really starts to kind of give the product momentum. So those are big steps for seaweed, and we're watching it really closely and we're really excited about it.
Yeah, which is a quick note on that too is, that's sort of where the state of things are in and around the New England area. Overseas there are well-developed markets. TNC is even working on a project down in Belize, and that team looking at growing seaweed products with local fishermen down there, part of our broader aquaculture efforts. So the focus of this discussion is sort of our neighborhood, but there's more beyond our backyard.
Thank you. And so last question, I think, unfortunately, due to time, and Chris, you mentioned the markets, you mentioned the current situation with COVID-19, and how many growers are there in Massachusetts, and how are farmers and particularly smaller growers faring in light of COVID-19? How are you working to adapt?
So there are just under 400 permitted farms in Massachusetts. There's a similar number in Maine that's grown quite a bit over the years. Of that, there's probably a third of them that are sizable, operations that employ, more than kind of mom and pop level staff. So for those people, they're the ones that have the real cash flow challenges from kind of sitting on their crop. So from a grower standpoint, it's a little scary times right now, just with the uncertainty of everything, but product is in the water and it's growing, which once it reaches a certain size, it becomes devalued. So that's a concern. Market dynamics with a stockpile of supply coming online with potentially very limited demand if restaurants aren't allowed to open fully, or if, as anticipated, a lot of the restaurants that closed will not reopen for business. Those are kind of scary things, and 70% of seafood in general is sold to restaurants. So that's a huge impact, just having all these places closed right now for the industry writ large. From our standpoint at Island Creek, we've, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, we have gone heavy over the last decade really into direct-to-consumer online retail. Normally that's less than 10% of our overall revenue. However, now it's surged something like 1,100% year over year for the last 4 or 5 weeks. And it's now replaced, 30 or 40% of our normal revenue at this time. So that's a boon for us. We're able to maintain a lot of our staff, but it's also an incredible boon for our farm, but also right now we work with about 150 other farms to provide product each week. So we've been kind of trying to spread the love and rotate it around among these small growers, because these are definitely challenging times for them, and no one knows what's coming down the pipe, obviously.
Chris, Steve, thank you so much. Anything either of you'd like to add before we kind of wrap up today?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks for putting this on, James, and for everybody who's putting in questions and interested in this. I don't know if there's a way to share like my contact information. I'd be glad to follow up with people that have questions that either weren't answered, or if this is sparking a conversation for down the road. But thanks a lot for the opportunity, and sorry we can't be together, and hope everybody stays safe out there.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great to chat this through with everybody. I think my takeaway for aquaculture in general is that, there's not all aquaculture is good aquaculture. That's for sure. But I think that there's such tremendous potential for the way we produce food and the way that food interacts with the environment where it's grown, for aquaculture to move the ball down the court in that relationship, that confronting and grappling with the negative aspects of it is just as important as talking about the positive aspects. So I think it's a worthwhile endeavor, and I really appreciate everyone signing on in unsure times to hear us out.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again, Chris and Steve, and thanks everyone who joined. As Chris just said today, a great turnout and so many questions. Apologies for not getting to them all. We will be sending a follow-up email, and we can provide some follow-up information that will help with that. So, please stay in touch with us. You can connect with the Nature Conservancy on nature.org/mass, also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can also find Island Creek Oysters at islandcreekoysters.com and all over social media. Hoping everyone stays safe and healthy. And again, just really appreciate all the time and interest today. So I hope you'll join us for the next Nature Connects webinar. And bye, everyone.
Cheers.